Today, I am going to talk about the hardest part, from my perspective, of being a convicted criminal. Before I do, and I have got to make this disclosure, I'm not complaining. The people with whom we work are not seeking sympathy or empathy. We are not complaining. I mention this because every now and again, when I mention the word hard with convicted criminal, people will say, well, it wouldn't be so hard if you didn't break the law. You shouldn't have done the crime if you weren't prepared to do the time. I'm not complaining. If anything, my experience with the criminal justice system was productive, learned so many lessons, the perspective I gained. It was freaking fantastic, if you want to know the truth. Some people think I'm a little nuts and insane for mentioning how productive it was. I shared this story when I came home from prison. I was at a dinner party with my good friend, Sam Pompeo, with whom I sold real estate for 3 years. I actually worked in the real estate office in the halfway house. And we were at this party and everyone's like, oh, you went to prison. How was it? I read your book. And are you okay? Can we talk about it? And I said, prison was fantastic. It was like the best experience of my life. And then a couple of friends, including Sam, had to call me over and say, dude, I get it, but you shouldn't tell people how great prison was. They're going to think you're nuts. It was productive. And I learned a lot of lessons, and I want to share some of them with you. Now, with that disclosure out of the way, let me transition into what the hardest part may be. Now, look, depending on where you are in the journey, you may think, well, this is the hardest thing that I can endure. Maybe it's losing your job and then getting indicted and reading your Department of Justice press release and then going to prison and then coming home, having to rebuild. Everything along the way is hard. But to a degree, you kind of get desensitized to it the more hits you take. You're like, oh, DOJ press release. I got up. Sentenced to 2 years. Boom. I got up. I'm okay. I'm living. I'm alive. I'm okay. My kids still love me. It's okay. Going to prison. I can't get past that first day in prison. Oh my God. I got past the first day in prison. I'm okay. So you kind of become conditioned. You just begin to overcome things you probably were thinking at one point you couldn't overcome them. With all of that said, the hardest part, from my experience, is the defendants who do not seek to change the narrative or prove people wrong. And that's really what I'm going to focus on in this video. The hardest part is not proving people wrong. Now you maybe think, well, who are these people, Justin? Well, it depends on where you are in the journey. Do you have a probation interview coming up? Are you working to change the narrative and prove to the probation officer you're different than your plea agreement, which I know many of you may think is made up and not true? Hardly a week passes without getting a call from a defendant lamenting over the plea agreement he felt compelled or forced to sign because he couldn't afford to go to trial or he didn't think he would prevail. So the onus is on you, depending where you are in the journey, to prove them wrong. Is that the probation officer? Is it a judge by way of your personal narrative or statement that you make at sentencing? What are you doing to prove them wrong? Because I can tell you, as a convicted felon 12 years running, despite people telling me that I was insane and nuts for writing about my journey in prison, despite people telling me when I came home from prison that I shouldn't speak and talk about it and travel the country, despite what people told me, I followed my own tuition, my own judgment. And I knew some people would think I'm a little crazy and a little nuts. I have no doubt when, my now wife, Sandra, when her family met me, they were probably like, oh, great, she's met some guy out of jail. Who's this guy? I think when they met me and I began to share lessons that I learned, I hope they viewed me differently. Why? Well, because they weren't just believing what they read online through my Department of Justice press releases. They weren't just judging me by my plea agreement. They were inspired, I think, by how I was working to change the narrative, by working to prove everybody wrong. And that's what I want you to be doing. It all starts with the perspective of the stakeholder, the prosecutor, the judge. They may view you cynically, not looking at the totality of your life and other good deeds you've done by some out of character moment that you've taken. I share this story with my baseball coach, Mike Gillespie from USC, who recently passed away. And my senior year, he came out to watch a game. I was like 0 for 4 with 3 strikeouts. It was a horrific game. Yet I was still invited to play at USC and I was on the team. Why? Well, he was willing to consider the totality of my whole high school career rather than one horrific, embarrassing, terrible game that I had in front of him. I'm asking you to do the same, to work on a daily, incremental basis to show that you are different than the government's version of events, that you are willing to prove these people wrong. Now, are you looking to sway and convince everyone? Of course not. That would be insane. There will always be people that judge me. There will always be people that will view you as an inveterate criminal, as a cheat, who's a thief, as a crook, as a felon, who takes pleasure in your pain, who's happy the fact that you went to prison, who will take all of their misery out on you. You know what? Let them. As a result of my experience, I gain some empathy and sympathy for those people, that something is so wrong in their life that they take such pleasure in your pain. Frankly, I noticed a lot of that in the Varsity Blues case, which our company has had such involvement. The pleasure in pain that so many people took in seeing these parents going to prison. It's just the way it is. So of course you're not going to persuade everyone. And if you're working under the presumption that you will, it's a mistaken presumption. Your goal is to try to look out 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years after you're dead and gone. What's the legacy you've left for your children and your children's children? When they talk about dad or grandpa and great grandpa who went to prison, are we allowed to talk about it? You want to be able to create a record that demonstrates that you learned from this, that you work to change the narrative, and you work to prove all of these people wrong, and that you were not going to be judged for some out of character decisions you made. So as I wrap up this video, let's point specifically to sentencing, for example. So I attended a sentencing recently where the government really tried to portray my client as just some greedy offender who went into business with intentions to steal and didn't really have a legitimate business. And this was a case that extended for several years, as many white-collar crime cases can, with cooperating witnesses. It took 3 years for this case to play out. What was the most impactful thing at my client's sentencing? He was able to convey in the narrative and in his statement what he had done during this 3-year window. They try to portray him as a greedy offender. Well, guess what? A greedy offender doesn't take a job measurably beneath your skill set, a minimum wage job for a good period of that time, and then save half of those resources and pay them over to restitution, beginning to change the narrative for the judge. A greedy offender, or someone who's entitled, doesn't take the time to authentically volunteer and give back. I'm not talking about going to the soup kitchen once a week, which is great, but then going to the soup kitchen once a week and posting it on Facebook as if you're a hero and getting 35 likes and sending that Facebook post to the judge, which is what some defendants do. I'm not knocking volunteer work. I'm talking about it as authentic and deliberate and over a sustained period of time with measurable results. This judge was able to see that while my client broke the law and pled guilty, and yes, he went to prison, he had taken measurable steps to show that he could become better. And he was very forward thinking in his vision, which all of you need to do. So as I wrap up, I began documenting my experience in federal prison when I was 33. And at the time I used to think, oh, the hardest part was going to prison and the DOJ release and getting fired. You overcome it. Parts of it you kind of learn to see how much you can overcome and how much adversity you can take. And then you get up the next day and you're like, hey, I'm okay. Then more bad news. I'm okay. And I'm okay. And I still ran today and I'm still loved and I can still read and write and think and I still ran my 10 miles. I'm okay. So for me, when I began to write, I was 33 and I wasn't married, nor did I have children, but I wanted to. And I served time with people in prison whose children weren't visiting them. And the narrative of their life was terrible. And a friend of mine in prison, his ex-wife changed the children's last name to her maiden name. And he said, oh, there's nothing I can do. I'm in prison and this is the rest of my life. Who cares when I get out of prison? It doesn't even matter. This is the rest of my life. And I didn't say to him at the time, I wasn't there, but 12 years later I am. He wasn't working to change the narrative. He wasn't working to prove all of these people wrong. And I want all of you, regardless of where you are in the journey, to work to prove them wrong. And that's how I'll close. We don't need sympathy. We're not asking for it. Many people who traverse the system like me are grateful for it, are kind of happy it happened. As insane as you may think that sounds, there's so many hidden benefits. And to learn more about them, you should read the daily blog I wrote every day in prison. You should read Lessons from Prison. Prepare. Pretty impressive. It only took me like 10 minutes or so to promote the books, but they're free. And that's how I'll close. While free, it is an investment of your time, because if you don't implement the lessons I discuss on this video, you got nothing. It's a talking head for 10 minutes. You go on, you watch another video, you've totally forgotten it. Look 50 years out, 100 years out, begin to work your way back and think, what is the next right thing to do for the next 5 minutes, 10 minutes, 30 minutes? Is it a letter to grow your network? Is it looking for a job, even if it's beneath your skill set? Is it making sure your lawyer fully understands who you are and he too or she too does not judge you as the government does? Maybe they're a former U.S. attorney who still thinks like a prosecutor. I don't know. I don't know you. Want to chat with me? Schedule a call, read the book, implement, act, work to change the narrative and prove to them that you're wrong. If you do, you'll emerge better and stronger and happier, as I did and as our clients do. Thank you for your time. Subscribe if you find value. Let's get to work. Back soon. Bye-bye.